Good morning. It is September 20. This is the C4 Metro Subcommittee, and Councilor Sherman is the co-chair.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Always good to see you all. And, bright and early in the morning, got our cups of coffee. We're ready to rock and roll. So today we have a relatively short meeting, but very straightforward. It's always good to have Ms. Bjerg here with us to share updates and information. And really, as is always the case, we like to have the smart people in the room with the electeds. So with that, we will kick off with JPAC update, and this is going to be this is the RTP process and update. So Karen, the floor is yours.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. You are so kind, Councilor Sherman. And so I do anticipate, and I know it's just right at the beginning of the meeting, but Jamie Lorenzini may also be joining us. She's the TPAC representative for the cities. And overall, this is kind of this is jointly both an update for JPAC, but it's a TPAC kind of overview because we had this information. So one of the reasons, so what I'm talking about, and it's the information really starts on page 5 of your C4 Metro packet, which is a memo that we received in our TPAC packet. But the information will be very similar to what JPAC will see tomorrow. And why we felt it was important to be able to have this conversation today with you. I know there's a kind of a short agenda, but the RTP is moving into its final stages. The real goal is to be able to have an RTP that's adopted by Metro Council, and I believe the date is December 6th. So in order to build up to that, the final pieces of the RTP will be both going through MPAC as well as JPAC. So at the upcoming meetings, both at JPAC this month, and I believe probably MPAC this month, there will be an update about it. In October at MPAC, there will actually, it's my understanding, will be an action item, a recommendation, and then JPAC provides its recommendation to Metro Council in November. So this really is the foundation of all of the work that's been happening over the past 2 years. And as you all know, there's been a lot of work. So I'm gonna talk a little bit, give a little bit of an update of the RTP timeline and process. At the meetings at JPAC and MPAC, there'll be an overview of the public comments. So we'll really just touch on that lightly. And then really I'll talk about the process that Metro's going to be using to what I call land the plane, right? Take all of the comments, move it forward, figure out really where are the discussion areas, what really is left to talk about. And then they have a very long list of what would be called consent items. So we'll talk about each of those. And again, all of this is covered within the memo that we provided in your packet. Let's see. So again, we're right here at the end. I'll give you like a little just snapshot of the public comment. As you all may know, is that the RTP includes both all of these projects. We've talked about projects before. Each jurisdiction submitted projects into the RTP, but it's also a set of policies. So it's those two things together that are moving forward. And so Metro had a public comment period that was between July 10th and August 25th. And they received tons of comments, more than they ever have. And they've really reached out to a lot of people during this process. So as a part of that, and I think I mentioned this, but I'll just be real specific. We'll be looking at these at MPAC on October 25th is the recommendation date, and JPAC gives their recommendation in November. Let's see, as a part of this, really it comes down to, from the various comments, and you all may remember C4, starting from C4 Metro Subcommittee and then on to C4, C4 provided a letter about some key issues. And some of the key issues that are remaining really overlap with those issues that that C4 was concerned about. So there's opportunity in this next, both at the JPAC meeting and this month's MPAC meeting, to talk more deeply about those items. And those items, so there's 5 items that Metro is looking to focus on. They're calling them policy topics. And the 5 policy topics, they got a lot of comments about investment mix, kind of as we think about the projects, the mix of investments between transit and roadway, and those type of investments. In other parts of the region, there were more concerns about the investment mix, but in Clackamas County, actually there was a lot of public support for the mix of investments that we put into the RTP. I don't believe any of our jurisdictions, I have not heard that any of our jurisdictions have been asked to even sort of move projects around within the RTP categories. But that is one thing that that is going on in different parts of the region. Like, because of public comment, sometimes the public comment was, maybe we, hold on, I've got a dog that's barking. Can you guys hear that? Hold on. Oops, actually, I almost hit the leave webinar. Sorry, just a little dog thing. But anyway, so the investment mix, actually the public supported our investment mix. And I don't think we've had any requests to move the projects from one category to the next. Oops, sorry. And the second category policy is really talking about the application of the pricing policies in the toll projects. And that was an item that maybe we want to talk about further. That was something that C4 also brought up. Like, we have a lot of concerns about how these toll projects are moving forward and how the policies that are within the RTP really are reflected in those projects. So that's one category we may want to hear more about or dig a little deeper into. There's also a strong interest, and this was another thing that kind of our C4 group talked about, was really talking about how do we talk about the big picture of transportation funding, right? One of the things that we look to in the future is, we know that transportation funding continues to be constrained, and what's JPAC's role going to be in that? The fourth policy item really relates to climate tools and analysis. And the comment that that was put forward by C4 had to do with, we really need to be looking at electric vehicle infrastructure and how that's planned for and how that interacts with the kind of with the RTP. And then finally, the last policy discussion is about the regional mobility policy. And that's where we get really kind of deep into wonky application, but it's also been a conversation that's been ongoing for quite some time. And it still has a ways to go before it's really clear on how it will end up being implemented. So that's kind of the big picture. Before I hand it over to Jamie to kind of fill in the holes that I missed, how Metro is hoping that this, they're going to land the plane on the RTP, is that there'll be opportunities to talk about those 5 policy options at JPAC. But there's also a very long list of what they call consent items. And I think there's 600 different entries plus that are specific comments, and how the response is, what the Metro's response is. And several of those is, and amend to change, right? But it's it's an amendment that would align with conversations. So there may be items within that very long list that some of your staff have been looking at and might bring forward to you as items that should be talked about either in that MPAC or JPAC venue. So I'm going to stop talking for a little bit. I'm going to let Jamie address things that I missed, and then I'm really hoping that we're going to just open it up for folks to talk about both those 5 policy issues, or if there's anything else that's missing.
Very good. Thanks, Karen. Jamie, it's all yours. And we are not, I'm not hearing you. Anybody else?
Tell you what,
Oh,
there's
there we go.
on my keyboard that's a mute microphone button. That button is a trap.
We've got you now.
Okay, so tomorrow at JPAC, I anticipate that you may hear quite a bit about the public comment period. And Metro has done an incredible job this cycle doing public engagement. One of the big tools of data collection that was used this cycle was an online survey. And a lot of useful information came out of that tool. But as we continue to talk about findings from public engagement, it may be helpful to view that tool within the context of its data limitations. Primarily being that this online survey was online and opt-in, meaning that it's not scientifically valid, or rather, this survey, if people choose to participate, it means that they have sufficient bias to participate. It's not geographically balanced. So while we're getting good information or helpful information, the information that we're getting may not be completely representative of the region as a whole. That being said, Karen did point out one of the most interesting findings, in my opinion, around the investment mix, that in Clackamas County, the survey participants supported generally the mix of investments that we submitted to the RTP, which wasn't the case in neighboring counties. That being said, these findings, even though they're not scientifically valid, could be a useful way of talking about how every part of the region is going to have different transportation needs. Because our region is diverse, we have different topography. Also, we have quite a large urban expansion front, and those places need infrastructure. Another interesting thing that's coming out of this survey, not out of this survey, but Karen spoke a bit about the mobility policy. There's a lot that still needs to be discussed in the mobility policy in terms of how do we understand it, how do we explain it to people who don't work in the transportation world, because it is pretty complex when we bring in different lenses to talk about how reliable is our system, or how well is traffic moving, and for who is traffic moving. And those are all important things. So today we've talked quite a bit about the different policy areas that will be coming forward. That being said, there are opportunities to elevate different topics if something is missing. Karen mentioned that there is a large consent bucket of technical amendments, smaller amendments, refining amendments. If I recall, that document is like 117 pages. That being said, JPAC or MPAC members can pull items out of that bucket for additional conversation, is my understanding. So I'm interested to hear today if there are additional topics that aren't reflected in those 5 policy areas that we should continue to advocate for or lift up as a county.
Very good. Thank you. I appreciate that lead in. And huge topic. And I'm the first one to admit that I didn't go and pull down the 700-page document with all of the comments across multiple jurisdictions. But as I read through our condensed version, one of the things that comes to mind, and I think it's always really interesting to see when you can call the information by county, how the responses differ. And it's to me, and as a layperson, it seems readily obvious that so the first thing that happens, and Jamie, you kind of hit on this, there is an underlying bias. Those that are willing to jump online and fill out a form or do some response are already engaged in the process. So we're not getting a representation of what residents truly want in the area. We're getting a representation of those that are already engaged in this process. And as we look at Clackamas County versus Washington versus Multnomah, the responses, again, in my mind, fall in alignment with the types of infrastructure that are already there, the opportunities for the various types of transportation utilization. Clackamas County leans much more toward kind of the increase of the transportation infrastructure, widening highways, more efficient, methods of getting vehicles around. Multnomah County, it leans much more toward, or at least the responses lean more toward bicycle infrastructure, walking infrastructure. And that seems pretty consistent across, all the responses that we're seeing. So what I'm always kind of curious about is, sorry, jumping around my thoughts here. And in the document, a lot of the phrases that are pulled forward in the document, a lot of the quotes are in alignment with those responses you would expect to receive in those areas. So they kind of actually seem a little leading in how those responses are incorporated. So my question that I'm always kind of trying to answer is, how does this broad array of information get distilled down to a manageable piece of information that then conclusions can be drawn from? Because it is, it's not objective. It's good, it's helpful, it's useful information. And then, of course, the bottom line is we have nowhere near enough money to do anything that we're trying to accomplish. So now we have to take this wide array of things and take it down to the best of the worst, or the most of the least, or whatever that phrasing would be, to try to get this delivered. So sorry for pontificating, Mr. Gronke. I see your hand is up. The floor is yours.
Well, Councilor Sherman, you and I think, approached this in the same fashion. I did not download the 700-page document. I have a couple of basic questions. Number one, unless I read it wrong, in the early part of the document, Metro mentioned that they had sent this survey out to CPOs in Washington County. I'm the chair of a CPO in Clackamas County. We certainly never got a copy of the survey, and I'm wondering if anyone knows why they chose to send them out only to the CPOs in Washington County. That's my number one question. Number two, the impression I got in reading the overall survey was that I had the impression that the majority of the respondents did not feel that the approach was actually matching what they would like to see in this area. Am I wrong in that?
Go ahead, Jamie.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. I think the way you're characterizing it is probably correct, that if we looked at the volume of survey responses, that a large number of people don't feel like the investment mix reflects their values. That being said, I think we need to have a broader conversation about why it doesn't reflect their values. Is it the number of projects that are, say, safety projects versus street projects? Or is it the difference in funding that's going to each of these projects? Something to consider is that a road project, in my opinion, is going to be significantly more expensive than a bike project or a trail project. Those are different types of infrastructure. So even if we have, say, way more bike ped projects, that road project may be more expensive than all of them, and perhaps all of them combined. So more information is needed.
And I think another thing that I would add that we've heard around, at least at TPAC from some of the other jurisdictions, is that in some ways it's very difficult through just a survey to communicate all of the different investments a jurisdiction may be doing. It's hard for people to hold that the RTP is really only those very kind of larger dollar investments on our collector and arterial system that are regionally significant, regionally important. Whereas jurisdictions such as the city of Portland, actually, well, as well as Clackamas County, as well as any city, not every single one of their transportation investments is going to be reflected in the RTP. And so when someone is taking a survey, they don't really, they may not recognize that. They may not recognize that some safety investments that are lower cost dollar aren't included because they're actually within a city's CIP and don't need to be on the RTP. So that's one concern that jurisdictions have is that people weren't necessarily, maybe didn't have the whole picture of everybody's transportation investments. I think another thing we've heard from ODOT is that there were concerns sometimes about the characterization of the different investments. There are some investments that ODOT is doing that may address both roadway, sidewalk, safety, all across the board. But it was within the RTP survey, those were all categorized as roadway. And they didn't really account for the other kind of adjoining investments that were also occurring. So I think what that does is it shows that surveys are helpful. And like Jamie said, they're not the only thing that really leads to the decision making, right? You need to take in the whole picture of what's going on, but it's helpful to know that what this portion of the population is thinking. And with respect, I know you had the question about whether or not it was distributed to all CPOs throughout the region. I do know for Clackamas County, when we had the information, a lot of times we push it out via social media. There'll be a social media push on the different surveys that are available. So I'm not quite sure, and I can get back to you, Ed, on whether or not we also sent directly to our CPOs. But I'll check in with Ellen on that.
Very good, very helpful. I mean, I think, you know, the survey is very helpful. And I think, you know, you can't make it the questions too open-ended, because, you know, you need to have some structure around the way the responses are received. I mean, it's kind of, in my mind, it's a lot like the kind of the fallacy of the right track, wrong track index that we hear quoted at the national level. Now, you know, 70% of people feel that the US is on the wrong track. Doesn't mean we all see it in the same direction. Just as many are the exact opposite as another. And so as we look at how these types of resources are being utilized at the regional level, and you say that, you know, many are in disagreement with how resources are being utilized or what projects are being put forward, you're going to have just as many saying there should be more bike trails as there are saying that there should be less bike trails and more highways. And so, but you're going to get a significant number, if not the majority, saying we're off track as far as what we're trying to accomplish at a regional level. So I think that, you know, these surveys can be very helpful in narrowing that information down and at least getting us, you know, some general consensus. I mean, a lot of times what I'm looking at in relation to this is what topics is there consensus, or what topics do we feel like we're getting good, reasonable responses across multiple counties? And I think, you know, like public safety or safety on public transportation is one that seems like there is consensus across the board. People perceive it as unsafe and therefore they're not using it. And that is something we can agree on. And that is something that really can be improved, because that, to me, that's the linchpin of how we get all these other pieces working in alignment. Is we need a much more robust public transportation system, and it needs to be actively utilized across the region. Mayor Buck, I see your hand is up. I will stop pontificating.
Thanks, Councilor Sherman. So of the, I just want to, Karen, you kind of went over this, just want to clarify. So were any of the changes that that we recommended incorporated into the draft, or have there been no edits?
What I will say is it's my understanding around the topic of electric vehicle infrastructure that that Metro staff is developing a response that will integrate that into the RTP. So they saw a request. They're interested in integrating it. They'll be developing these things along the way, because they had this list of comments they're trying to get to. But that was one of them they heard. So another comment, and I don't have the C4 letter up in front of me, but you know, I know this has been a topic, and it has to do with how the tolling policies are represented in the specific toll projects. That's both a conversation that they're calling a policy conversation. So there'll be opportunities at MPAC and JPAC to talk about that further, but they will also bring forward a recommendation on how that can be done better. So So a lot of what we know now is they did here, and they're developing proposals. And they're open to hear how that can be, that should be done and reflected. Does that make sense?
No.
Oh.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. No, that's all right. It really gets down to the language. What is the language we're going to adopt, right? And so what I anticipate around on the tolling conversation, that there will be specific language added to either, I believe they said at TPAC, potentially the ordinance. This is where it gets really kind of tricky. How the RTP is adopted and how that that impacts the tolling projects, or within what's called Chapter 8, where the tolling projects are described. There'll be specific language that directs those tolling projects to, whenever they kind of come back to Metro for a let's say an MTIP change, that they would need to show how they're complying with the tolling policies. So it's kind of like that. That's what I mean. You know, they'll bring back specific language that talks about that. Let's see, what were the other? I think the other discussion item, and maybe there may be interest in talking about it a little further, is this idea of how the greenhouse gas, and you know, I know I've talked about electric vehicles, but whether or not, let's see, how they frame it is climate tools and analysis, you know, how that, how us achieving our climate goals is reflected within the RTP. And there were concerns about that. I don't remember if that was a specific C4 concern or not, but this is a place that, again, at JPAC and MPAC, our representatives can bring forward more specific concerns about those things.
Thank you, Karen.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. Jamie, did you have a comment?
Yeah, real quick, just to hold intention. Right now, our conversation is focused on the unresolved policy topics, but there is a very large volume of policy areas or refinements to the RTP that are under that consent umbrella. And Metro staff have done a bang up, awesome job taking all of that public feedback and breaking it down by line item and responding to it. And within that response, I know your staff, Will Farley, has submitted comments. And it looks like some of those comments did in fact result in changes. And those comments will be reflected in the public comment report. So if you search by Will's last name, you can see the changes that have been made.
Very good. Thank you. Other thoughts, comments, questions? You know, I guess maybe one thing, and I apologize if this is already in the document, but you know, one of the things that we've kind of looked at is the alignment between transportation and housing production and job creation and industrial expansion. And so is there alignment between like transportation projects and kind of the urban expansion areas and kind of how those allow them to grow? You know, I mean, Metro's put a lot of value on these urban expansion areas, but at the same time, without that infrastructure, I mean, the infrastructure is incredibly expensive, and that's really one of the hurdles to overcome. Is there any alignment between that, or did I just miss that as part of the document?
There is more we can do. In the RTP, we have a chapter called Chapter 8, which is called Moving Forward Together, and it's all of the future work that we want to do, or it's our regional program investments. And those may be areas where we can talk about how do we take our existing framework for funding or technical assistance and find a way to help prioritize urban expansion areas, because those areas go beyond just transportation infrastructure. Those areas help Metro meet its other goals around things like housing production. And if there's a way that Metro can come alongside us in new and unique and creative ways, maybe there's ways that we can accelerate development in those areas. And maybe that's a comment that could be elevated at JPAC or MPAC if there's interest, to think those things through a little bit further.
Yeah, and I would I appreciate that Jamie brought that forward because again, there's 5 policy areas that they're already planning on talking about. And one of them is funding, transportation funding. And transportation funding as a category to talk about is pretty large. But what, and so some of what people think about when we talk about transportation funding is growing the pot, right? Being able to have more access. But what Jamie was just saying talks about, well, how we also spend that pot and prioritize investments is also important. And being able to within our existing structures, be able to prioritize transportation investments that would support those new urbanized areas could be something that's really, you know, kind of articulated and brought and said, this is important as a part of this conversation. I think another place that where at least within the RTP, this importance of land use, the interplay between land use and transportation will can be seen. Again, is in that chapter 8 in future projects, and that is the coordination with the 2040 refresh project. And being able to emphasize the importance of both how these new urban spaces develop is very important to our transportation system. It's related to transit, all of these different things. So continued partnership on that particular project on specifically around transportation is important. So.
Very good. Thank you, Councillor Pratt.
Yeah, you hit right on my question. It's so this is my first time through this, but once the RTP is adopted, and obviously, like you've alluded to and Councillor Sherman said, there are a lot more projects to be done than funds. So is there some kind of prioritization process, or is it just everybody, you know, putting in and fighting for those funds?
I can jump in on this one. So the RTP is a planning tool, but then there are mechanisms and other tools we use to actually program funding. One of the tools we use is called REFA, or the Regional Flexible Fund Allocation. And that is a small pool of funds that can help support local projects. That process is supported by a conversation that happens at JPAC and at the Metro Council to create guidance around what types of projects should be prioritized in a cycle. There are other types of funding, however, that are also available for projects that are on the RTP constrained list. So projects that are reasonably expected to have funding. Those projects are qualified for federal funding opportunities. So it is competitive, but there are opportunities. And maybe something we can do in the future is consider how to increase our grant writing capacity here in Clackamas County to ensure that we're not just competitive, but we're the most competitive county. And they should fund us every single time because we're the best.
Very good. Mayor Milch, you're next up.
Thank you. I raise this issue every time. Kind of helping to inform myself on these issues, I've gone back into history and came across the time period probably 25 years ago when there was a process or a concept called LUTRAQ, LUTRAQ, which stood for the Land Use, Transportation, Air Quality Connection. And that was the basis for some of the policy making at that time. And, you know, it starts with land use, and I'm glad to see that there is a chapter in this that focuses on that. But, you know, going back even further in history, back when the state first started cities to develop comprehensive plans, and in, you know, one simple way of looking at it is the Washington County zoned their land with a lot of industrial land. And that's why we have Nike and Intel and those companies out there. And Clackamas County zoned a lot of their land for residential, which is why a lot of the employees that work at those companies live in Clackamas County, because that's where there was you know, more affordable and available housing, but they are commuting a long way to work. So when it comes to their satisfaction with our transportation system, most of the Clackamas County people gave it a 4, and Multnomah County people give it a 1. And, you know, for a variety of reasons we've already discussed, we don't know how valid that is. If it's one guy, you know, turning in 100 surveys, giving it a 1 every time because he's really not happy with the lack of bike transportation. But I would like to see, you know, again, more emphasis, and I'm glad it's at least mentioned in there, on land use issues. Greater focus on creating greater proximity to people's daily needs within the areas where they live, and emphasis on shorter distance trips rather than long trips. And on the issue of the safety with, you know, public transit, 20 years ago, when my wife and I first started visiting Portland and moving into Portland in the early 2000s, we took the MAX a lot because of the free fare zone in downtown. And we saw people like us, people who we felt safe around, people who we could converse with on the train. And we use it very rarely now and never feel anywhere near as safe or never feel anywhere near as surrounded by people like us. So that safety issue, I think, is important. And, you know, I don't know how TriMet could fund their system if they restored some free fares, but it might be something that would improve ridership anyway. But just a variety of comments. I'll throw them in and always want to participate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Milch. It may be of interest to you to have a look at the mobility policy that's being recommended through the ODOT or the RTP process, which will affect the way we do some of our land use planning through things like comprehensive plan amendments. Also, with regard to transit safety, I see that John Sarah is on the attendees list. Hey, John. I want to point out that TriMet is doing things to try and improve user safety. Perhaps the conversation then becomes, how do we come alongside TriMet or other transit providers like SMART to really help maximize what our transit agencies are already doing, or do them in new and creative ways to make them more effective? Because it seems like it may really take a village to help make this transit system thrive.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jamie. And if I can jump in for just a second, TriMet, and thank you for your comments, Mayor Milch. I do appreciate what you say. TriMet is working on a number of different ways to approach the safety and security issue right now. Some of them I can share, and some of them will be coming out in the coming weeks. I know you've all heard a lot about TriMet safety and security lately on the news, with the stabbing on the Green Line and the news about drug and fentanyl use on the trains and in our communities. I want to say first and foremost, if any of you and your city councils are interested in hearing an in-depth report about what's going on and what we are doing, I am happy to work with you to get someone from TriMet to come and present directly to your city council. Please let me know and reach out if you'd like me to do that. But in general, you know, we are working extremely hard to address the situation, increase security on all of our system. We have doubled the amount of unarmed security guards that are on our system in the last year, I think, and we are continuing to staff those up constantly. We have additional funding for transit police. I think we have funding for 65 police officers, but we're only able to staff about 14 or 15 of them, and that's because our local cities provide those officers and they don't have the staff to do that right now. So like Jamie said, addressing this issue is a community problem. I mean, these are issues that exist in our communities, and that's why they're happening on TriMet as well. And we want to be a part of the solution, and we're happy to work with all of you to that end. And like I said, please reach out to me if you'd like to coordinate something in a presentation to your city councils, or if you'd just like to meet with me to talk a little bit more about what's going on. I'm happy to do that individually as well.
Very good. Appreciate the comments. And, you know, and I will defend TriMet for a moment. I do ride the train periodically, and, you know, have never had any problems or issues. I mean, it's you know, as a sheer percent of the daily movement of people, the negative outcomes are very, very small, but it's still, that's what catches people's attention. And it's just, I mean, it's the same thing as when we talk about deaths on the highway. It's an issue as a percent of the actual people that move. It's an incredibly small number, but it is still an issue that needs to be addressed. And if we are going to truly increase ridership to positively impact the overall system, the perception has to be that it's a safe place to be. And so the actions still need to be there.
Absolutely, Chair. I mean, perception is reality. I ride the train every day. I feel safe on the train, but I see the issues as well. And, there's so many people who haven't ridden since 2020, 2021, when there were a lot of issues that we have addressed to some degree at this point, and their perception is still in that frame, and getting people back on the system to see that things are changing is important. But yes, perception is reality. So we want to be part of the solution, bringing people back.
Very good. Other thoughts, comments, questions? We're getting close to the end of this topic, but we have lots of time today, so I'm available here. Anybody have any other things to bring up?
I have a question. So John, since we've had COVID and people started working from home, I would imagine that the type of riders have changed from commuters to maybe other people.
Yeah, I mean, since COVID's happened, we have noticed a huge sea change in just every type, every aspect of our ridership. We're not seeing as much peak rush hour traffic of everyone coming in from the suburbs and going into downtown Portland in the morning and then going home in the afternoon. The data shows that people are riding much more consistently throughout the day, throughout the weekend, at different times, and they're using it for different reasons than they were before. It's not just commuter traffic, it's recreation, it's shopping, it's all across the board. And that makes trying to capture these riders much more challenging than it was pre-COVID. And that's one of the reasons why TriMet is rolling out its Forward Together plan, which was developed with your community, specifically working with your staff to try and figure out how we can better address the needs of the current riders and, address exactly where they're trying to get to and when and how to provide that service. So we are rolling out Forward Together over the next, I think, 2 years. I think it's going to take maybe another 2 fiscal years to get that done. That's all budgeted. The constraint actually is staffing bus and train operators. So as we're getting those staff up and running, we are rolling out those new service changes, and we'll be in touch with your communities about that. But yes, so we are very aware that the ridership has changed, and we are working to address it.
Well, one would assume that, but by moving away from condensed predictable ridership at rush hour times coming and going to central work areas, moving into a much more dynamic system, I would assume is much more expensive to run, because you can't use as much high capacity throughput, and you have to have a lot more drivers throughout the course of the day. And it is a lot less predictable. So rather than having 2 big peaks and a little bit of ridership, it's modest ridership all day long, which means you have to staff up a ton more if you're going to have the frequency that you'd like to support that system. So Jamie, I see your hand is up. Sorry, I jumped in front of you.
No, I know we're running short on this agenda item, so I'd love to bring things full circle on the TriMet safety item, or the transportation transit safety item. John, I wonder if it might be low-hanging fruit for us to connect outside of this meeting and troubleshoot or brainstorm some of the system-adjacent safety needs that jurisdictions, whether it's the county or metro or cities, could help start doing some creative thinking around how to support effective transit, whether it's lighting at transit stations or if it's coffee with a counselor on the bus.
Yeah, Jamie, that sounds great. I'll shoot you an email after this, and we'll connect and start working on that, and we can loop in some of our safety professionals here at TriMet as well.
You rock. Thanks, John.
Very good. Good conversation. Very robust. Not seeing any other hands, we will transition to our next topic item, which is our MPAC debrief and update, which I don't think we had an MPAC meeting last month, but we did in August, is my memory correct? Mayor Buck, you want that? Commissioner Shaw, I'm sorry, please.
Well,
The floor is
yes,
yours.
and in fact, our last MPAC meeting was on 26th July. We had no meeting in August. On 26th July, we had 3 information discussion items. The first one was on the 2023 state legislative recap. Annalise Kohler from Metro and Jenna Jones talked about the 2023 state legislative session is issues that pertain to the MPAC, including housing and land use. The second item was an information briefing on the 2024 urban growth management decision, long-term role of housing production in housing affordability, to include filtering, gentrification, and displacement trends. That briefing was from Aaron Key, and Laura Combs, and they talked about the regional growth management decision coming in 2024 and MPAC's responsibility for input on that to Metro Council. They went on to talk about the UGB engagement plan with that will reach out to stakeholders and the public on the UGB decision-making process. And the third item was, again, on the 2024 urban growth management decision, long-term role of housing production, was from Ted Reed from Metro and Becky Hewitt. And they discussed the UGB expansion planning process and the need for demonstrating regional need for UGB expansion to accommodate anticipated household or job growth demand. And then Ted went on to talk about, in context of analyzing the future housing affordability, Metro has asked a consultant team to provide information on the impact of new housing supply on affordability of existing houses, including the relationship to filtering, which is the depreciation of housing over time that can make housing relatively more affordable in the overall housing market. So those 3 items were talked about on the 26th of July. All items have slides on the Metro MPAC webpage. I looked yesterday for an agenda for the 27th of September MPAC meeting, but there was nothing posted as of yesterday afternoon. So thank you.
Very good. Thank you for the update. I did appreciate that that I had never heard the phrase filtering before to describe houses decaying. It's a good thing. When your house starts to fall apart, it brings the price down. Therefore, it's a positive. But don't fix it, because if you fix it, then the price goes back up again.
It is a very interesting concept that I hadn't really ever heard of before, because we normally think of housing just as appreciating all the time. So we'll see how it works out.
So I guess, and maybe this is my pea brain not being able to wrap around the concept well, but so theoretically, if an area becomes more and more, we'll use the word blighted, but more and more in decay, the values of the homes will go down and therefore bring down housing prices. But again, it's kind of a chicken and an egg type scenario. I don't see it as a valid long-term prospect to housing affordability. And I think, the data that they did bring forward is, production does a lot more for housing values than the impact of filtering over a long period of time. Because in many areas you are seeing, as homes age, they are replenished, they are fixed up, they are replaced over time. And so it doesn't have as great an impact. But appreciate the update, Commissioner Shull. Any other thoughts, comments, questions regarding MPAC?
No, not today. Thank you.
Very good. Wow, are we actually getting close to the end of this this conversation today? Looking around the room to see any hands, any burning questions out there that we missed. Very good. Well, with that, we're quite a bit early. We could hang out for a while and just chat about what our days will look like today. Latest recipe that you tried that you really enjoyed? Anything? Counselor Lewis? Very good. All right. Well, with that, we will adjourn our meeting and go on with our days. I hope you all have a really, really pleasant day and look forward to seeing you all again very soon.